A world exists beyond that mundane little life that you live in. A world where intelligence is worshipped and pilots are God. A world filled with biotechnology that can save lives or end them.
A war is brewing beneath the surface of everything you understand to be real. Ours is a tale of revenge, love, and desperate ambition. Will you come with us?
I see you standing there, straight in an arrogance what I wouldn't give to tear you down.
Welcome to episode 3 of Interface, the Creator's Champion. We are your hosts, Ellie Popov
and Charles Jazz Terrier. Low listener, what are we waiting for?
Tango waves around your neck, we'll hang you out to dry.
Moving swiftly down the length of the corridor, Frey's blood bubbled, and she'd let it. She'd barely had her first hit of caffeine whilst she'd perused the activity report on her laptop when Frey had discovered the reality of Wyatt's arrogance. Not only was it way too early for this shit, but she was aghast. Frey'd known this kid was self-entitled, but she'd had no idea how sly, and, she hated to admit it, brave he was. Sneaking around their base at night, hacking into their technology, her files. She thought him to be a tech genius coward with the potential to be melded into a lion at their hands. But Wyatt had more guts than she'd thought. Guts weren't going to save him, though, from what she had in store for him. Frey stomped a little further down the corridor and rounded the corner to the bathroom, breezed past a watchful Isaiah and burst into the shower. Frey felt her fury rise even further as she sighted the silhouette of Wyatt armed in a hot mist, oblivious to her intrusion. Approaching him, she yanked the glass shower screen back so hard she was actually a little surprised it didn't shatter upon its collision with the wall. A very naked Wyatt stood under the streaming waterfall, his skin streaked red from the scalding water. Despite Frey's best efforts not to look, she couldn't help but notice the broad set of shoulders and the tone in his slim body, or the glimmer of blonde hair at his chest at the V of his lower abdomen. Not a kid, a man. Frey remained unassumed as Wyatt hurried to cover himself at her intrusion, his mouth agape in shock. "Get curious, did we?" Frey shot at him as he scrambled around. Wyatt looked at her in a panicked disbelief. "Do you mind?" Frey stepped closer to Wyatt, ignoring the water flicking onto her boots. "Absolutely, I mind. This isn't a hotel. You touch what I say you can touch." Recognition dawned on Wyatt's face as he realized what Frey was referring to. His expression became sheepish. "To be fair, I touch the computers all the time." Frey bit her tongue to stop from punching him, naked or not. She wasn't sure what she'd expected from Wyatt. An apology, maybe, or perhaps fear, or a promise not to do it again. But there was no remorse in his words. She needed to teach him his place, and she needed to do it now, before those late-night escapades became a regular occurrence. Frey stepped into the cubicle with Wyatt. The steam surrounding her was so thick that droplets formed and dripped like neat swirls on her face, down her back and between her breasts. She avoided the pattering water but pressed herself closely into Wyatt's space, looking to humiliate him into intimidation. Wyatt didn't step back, but he didn't look too sure of himself either. Good. "Then allow me to make this crystal clear," Frey said. "You go nosing around again or touch a single piece of tech without my direct permission and I'll cut you." She bore her eyes deeply into Wyatt's ocean blue ones, imploring him to remember when she'd last cut him, after he'd first been kidnapped. A threat she wouldn't hesitate to see through if he disobeyed her. Frey shifted her gaze down Wyatt's flushed body, patronizingly, and hovered on his barely covered genitals, driving home where exactly her first choice of cutting would begin. When she heard Wyatt give a loud swallow, she accepted his concede and turned, slamming the shower screen behind her. As she left the bathroom, Frey heard Wyatt shout, "I thought you were a hugger." At her retreating back, she paused in her stride 5 whole seconds, sucking in air and exhaling it back slowly, in an effort to stop herself walking straight back into that shower stall and smacking Wyatt right in the sarcastic, wet face. Yes, Wyatt definitely had guts, and it had better freaking pay off in the night ahead.
Jasper leaned over a small, mangled piece of tech, no larger than the size of a ping-pong ball, surrounded by Fergus and Isaiah. All 3 men were dressed in their circuit game's finest. Jasper himself had dressed in a slightly shredded gray t-shirt and ripped black jeans, with a heavy hooded leather jacket and thick black boots. His hair was slicked back from his forehead in the effortless way European male models tend to wear it, and smudged black eyeliner graced his eyes, giving Jasper a harsher, more mysterious look than he usually wore. Whatever the situation, Jasper always dressed himself for an entrance. He liked his presence to speak for himself. Don't tell people who you are. Show them. Tonight he knew he looked like a modern cyberpunk reminiscence of Blade Runner, but he also looked like a circuit games rock star. He wanted her to look at him and seethe, to see him and for her insides to shrivel up at what she'd lost. He wanted her to pivot. He wanted her heart to pivot to the bottom of her stomach and shatter into a million pieces, if it even still existed. From beside him, Fergus, dressed in studded leather coveralls and gunmetal-colored t-shirt, let out a sigh as he turned the device over. Even within the confines of their covert, makeshift base, the eyes of spies continued to find them. Julian's, Jasper directed to Fergus and Isaiah. Fergus chewed his lip before responding. I assume so. Jasper leaned around to look at Isaiah, the beast that he was, dressed in a pair of drop-crotch, baggy black military pants and a dark gray, long-sleeved crew-neck shirt patched with leather about the elbows, a metallic triangle pendant glistening from around his neck. He had to admit, Isaiah looked like an impressive force to be reckoned with, and though Jasper had trained Isaiah in hand-to-hand combat, even he wouldn't want to run into him pissed off in a dark alley. As Jasper made eye contact with the giant, he simply inclined his head in agreement with Fergus. I didn't think that was possible, Jasper remarked. Like gypsies, the team had often shifted location every few weeks, never settled anywhere for too long, their privacy a priority, even against Julian. To no avail, obviously. Fergus shrugged. It's a new model. So that's how Julian had skirted around their security measures. The new drone probably hosted a new stealth shield that bypassed their security triggers. Jasper flicked at the tech's mangled corpse. He'll be pissed. I'll have a fiddle with it and see if I can save it, Fergus replied nonchalantly. He picked the device up and plunged it into the rucksack hanging from his shoulder. Jasper remained unconvinced. The device looked pretty far gone to him. In fact, he was fully expecting to hear a lecture from Julian at some point in the near future about how their blatant disregard for the cost of expensive surveillance devices, ignoring the point, of course, that Julian had been spying on them in the first place. But Jasper supposed that Julian believed he had the right to access his little team at any time he pleased. Jasper wandered around the room to Frey, who was seated before a computer, focused on the screen in front of her, boots crossed and popped up on the desk. He took in her long black hair, swept back in a high ponytail and embedded with metal triangles along the left side of her head. Frey had stuck with her thickly cold-rimmed eyes and layered in additional hints of makeup that lengthened her lashes and enhanced the height of her cheekbones. Across her lips, she'd painted an appealingly dusky pink color that made them stand out against the tan of her skin. Frey wore a pair of low-slung black leather pants with a thick studded belt around her waist and a halter top that showed off her ample cleavage and toned midriff. It had been a while since Frey had looked like this much of a woman. Her being more concerned with the state of their operation. In fact, Jasper couldn't recall her dressing up so much since the last circuit games. As Jasper stepped back a little bit to take in the whole picture, he wondered how much trouble they were likely to get into tonight, or if the creator label would be enough to take care of the situation. Inwardly, he rolled his eyes. Jasper could see that Frey was focused on Wyatt's latest performance results. The team had put the kid through his paces again this morning, trying to cram in every bit of training they could before whisking him off to the slaughterhouse, aka the circuit games. Jasper approached closer to Frey and abruptly knocked her boots off the surface of the desk, relishing the little noise of protest that she made and subsequently filthy look that she gave him afterwards. Jasper took a sip of her coffee with a smirk. "Jasper! Manners!" Frey scolded annoyance, clear in her voice. After a breath, she continued back to business. Her focus again on Wyatt. He's scoring off the charts here. He may have this in the bag. Jasper glanced at Frey's screen and confirmed the truth of her words. Wyatt was miles above the other pilots they'd trained, except for one. Their first, for the first ever circuit games. But the difference between the two was that they'd spent months grooming their first pilot, whereas they'd only had a week with Wyatt. Jasper wasn't sure yet if this was a positive or negative experience for them. He didn't want to get too far ahead of themselves too fast. Just keep it in your pants, would you? Don't jinx it. Frey only sighed in response. Wyatt entered the training room from behind them. They'd left him to get ready unchaperoned, a psychological tactic to embed loyalty in the boy, almost like a master training their dog to walk without a leash. And like the puppy he was, thus he had tottered right back to them. Good. They needed him to behave at the circuit games. Jasper, together with Frey, Fergus, and Isaiah, all turned their eyes to the kid, who had entered in full circuit games regalia. They dressed him in a tightly fitted, long-sleeved black shirt and a gray and black padded bomber jacket. Charcoal skinny jeans with sections of gathered stitched panels across the knees and upper thighs met with black boots. The look was complete with a blue balaclava mask hanging from around Wyatt's neck, unsheathed from his lower face. On it was a black print of a panda skeleton, blood dripping from its enlarged fangs. With the change of an outfit, Wyatt had transformed from looking like a tech geek hauled up in his mother's basement to a man who looked like he could take on the cyber world. And Wyatt knew it too. Jasper caught the smize half-formed in the young man's eyes and straight, proud line of his back. Wyatt would fit right in. Maybe Frey was right. Jasper admitted to himself. To the team, he said, "Showtime." Frey and Jasper had insisted on making Wyatt deaf and blind for the trip to the circuit games. It was evening when they'd enforced the torturous mask back upon him and deafened his hearing with earphones, blaring the greatest renditions of Korn, and by force, Wyatt had been held down and the mask buckled to his head with a promise from Jasper to cut off his hands if Wyatt so much as rubbed at it. Wyatt hadn't seen the vehicle he'd been placed in, which perhaps drove for an hour or so before it smoothed to a stop. Suddenly, he felt a cool breeze across his exposed skin of his hands and face, and he guessed that a door had been opened. Hands, he wasn't sure whose, guiding him roughly to what felt like the pavement beneath the thick soles of his boots. Someone lifted the mask from his face. As Wyatt blinked his eyes rapidly, trying to focus them, his vision became consumed with Frey. Gorgeous, in a pair of tight leather pants, and matching halter, her long, dark hair twisted up in a sleek ponytail. She smirked into his face, and Wyatt smiled back as she reached around his lobes, gently removing the buds before stepping back. Quickly, Wyatt became conscious of the eyes of Jasper, Fergus, and Isaiah all upon him. Watching him stare at Frey, self-consciously he averted his gaze and instead turned in a semicircle, taking in his surroundings. Together, Wyatt and the team were standing at the end of a dark alleyway, connected to a quiet inner-city road. The pavement and style of the buildings looked familiar. The stench of spilled alcohol and stale cigarettes infiltrated his senses, and Wyatt glimpsed worn club posters glued haphazardly to the walls of the buildings on either side of the alley. Wyatt's instincts told him he was very likely in the valley, though not a part he'd ever seen. He could not help the sense of irony that rose up. Fortitude Valley was where his career had come to die, courtesy of Lion Insurance. Likewise, it also happened to be the place where everything could change, where it would change. Directly behind Wyatt was a black unmarked Mercedes industrial van, circa the late 2010s. Wyatt added another piece of the puzzle to his mental vault. "The hell are you staring at, Princess?" Jasper said gruffly, breaking Wyatt's train of thought. He placed a hand on Wyatt's shoulder and began to march him down the alleyway. Wyatt moved as Frey tossed the gear they'd forced on him into the back of the van and slid the door shut. He didn't need to look back to hear the other three pace behind Jasper and himself. As they neared the end of the alley, Wyatt could see that it opened up to an entrance of an old-style brick industrial warehouse. He could feel, rather than hear, the thumping of bass vibrating beneath his feet, a sure sign of the activity he suspected was going on inside. The circuit games. Neither Frey nor Jasper or Fergus had given him much of a heads up as to what to expect from the first round of the circuit, with regards to experience. Maybe they thought it was better to leave him in the dark and make him suck it up, rise to the occasion under duress, but the lack of information had only increased Wyatt's nervousness. At the entrance of the warehouse, a lanky, pasty-pale, blonde man who looked no older than Wyatt leaned against the brick wall, talking to a stunning petite woman who reminded him of a pixie. Her angles sharp and beautiful, her hair a riot of bouncing short pink curls, the color of fairy floss. His first clue to the circuit other than his own outfit. Wyatt thought the lanky guy was doing a bit of a shit job at guarding the entrance to the sacred first night of the games, but the casualness of the guard incited him in a small amount of ease. Wyatt watched the guard straighten at the sight of them. The woman he was with slipped through the entrance door, and Wyatt caught the back-end wave of a crowd roar over the top of a house techno track. He couldn't control the goosebumps that rose on his arms beneath his jacket, and he fought his instincts to rub them away. He was stunned to hear the guard greet Jasper and Frey like old friends, or something more, with a large, sleazy smile pasted across his pasty face. Welcome, creators. Wyatt snuck a side glance sideways at Jasper, who just beamed like a Cheshire cat, enjoying Wyatt's surprise. Frey stepped around them and approached the guard. Hail. She greeted the guard warmly, with that familiar tilt of her chin. Fergus reached into his rucksack and presented Hail with something that looked like a USB. The guard grabbed it happily and swiped it across his scanner. 1 second. 2. Was Wyatt the only one feeling anxious? Because he looked around at the others, but they all seemed confident, excited. Filled with the thrilling bloodlust of the battle ahead, Wyatt broadened his shoulders, trying to replicate Isaiah's stoic stance. A reading ticked over on the scanner, and Hale lifted his head as it beeped, satisfied. He handed back the device to Fergus, who plunged it back into his bag. Hale shifted to the side and opened the entrance door, beckoning them forward with his long fingers. Always a pleasure. Hale practically purred at Frey and Jasper. Please enjoy your bar tab. As Jasper, then Frey, began to walk through the doorway, Hale turned his beady little green eyes on Wyatt. Stay away from Groundcloud, he said, his voice amused but a warning nonetheless. At least until after your placement round. Good luck, newbie. Hale stayed aside, watching each of them pass through the entrance, Wyatt the last to cross the circuit's threshold. But once he'd passed into the unknown, Hale pulled the door closed behind them, leaving them to wade through a blanket of darkness. Together they all walked down a set of stairs as the sound of music and the vibration of heavy bass seemed to increase louder and louder with each step. Their descension led them to a wide room complete with a large bar, pole dancing pedestals, a dance floor, and a number of seating areas and booths spread out tactfully. The space had the feel of a dirty, underground Amsterdam club. As neon lights danced into Wyatt's eyes and the Euro-electric dance music filled his ears, Wyatt's jaw involuntarily dropped. There, at the far side of the room, was what he assumed to be the live-action placement arena. And between Wyatt and that area was a sea of alternative patrons of all shapes, sizes, and ages, swarming the venue and reacting to the competing pilots because, yes, the competition had already begun. Without even realizing he'd done so, Wyatt stopped dead in his tracks. Jasper, Frey, Fergus, and Isaiah walked on ahead, but Frey only made it a few paces before she sensed Wyatt's unease. She turned and came for him. Almost tentatively, she reached out for his hand, snaking her smooth, soft fingers around his larger ones. When Frey felt Wyatt relax, she pulled him into the belly of the crowd without a word, leaving Wyatt flushed. Such a casual gesture, yet between them it felt so intimate. Wyatt tried to internally shake off the feeling. Together, Frey and Wyatt caught up to Jasper, Fergus, and Isaiah with little difficulty. Frey expertly navigating her way through the patrons, or rather, They had parted for her, admiration clear in their eyes, not having to think for himself. Wyatt looked around. It was clear to discern who the pilots were, as each seemed to be dressed flamboyantly, poised for display. Surrounding them were their faction, as Jasper had described to him, dressed similarly to their chosen pilots. One pilot in particular caught Wyatt's eyes. A tall man with long, wavy hair and a patch across one eye, dressed in a steel-colored poet shirt which ballooned loosely at the sleeves and tucked into a pair of tight leather pants. A cyberpunk pirate. Wow. As Wyatt passed him, his eyes still bound to the man, he bared his teeth back at Wyatt. From the front of their group, Jasper nodded to Isaiah, who flanked Fergus, and the two broke away from their small party, heading in a direction parallel to the placement arena. No sooner had Jasper nodded them off than a group of women dressed in a myriad of tight clothing sauntered up to him and began to pull Jasper towards the bar. Frey caught the sight and rolled her eyes. Wyatt and Frey were now right by what Jasper had explained to be the placement arena. Around them, the crowd let out another unified roar, signaling the arrival of another competing pilot in the ring. Wyatt halted, watching the scene hungrily. So focused he didn't even realize that Frey had dropped her grasp on his hand. The pilot, a lanky guy donning ripped jeans and gray rabbit ears, was stationed at a setup placed center stage, in clear view of the noisy patrons. A leadership mounted on the far wall was keeping track of the pilot's placements. This one had not yet placed, though Wyatt read his competing name to be Rabbit. He watched in fascination and relief as the competitor operated gaming spheres, the same ones Wyatt had been training on all week. From the side of the arena, two electrically adorned male hosts, opposites in stature, stood on a platform holding shiny golden microphones in their hands. Wyatt suddenly understood he'd been hearing their narrations echoing from the arena since they'd entered the warehouse. A foghorn sounded, indicating the end of the placement round, and the pilot, Rabbit, shrieked in annoyance, shoving at his spheres that didn't so much as budge at the force of his body. As Rabbit stormed from the arena, another man, the pilot's pit captain, scrambled up to the station, disassembling the spheres. The smaller of the hosts, a man barely taller than the medical threshold of a dwarf, boomed into his golden microphone. "Too bad," he taunted out to the buzzing crowd. "So very sad," chimed in his giant companion. Wyatt watched on as the name Rabbit was removed from the leadership board. The pilot scored so low he was being deemed irrelevant. It was that easy to lose. It was that easy to become nothing. The details on the leadership transformed into a big halftime sign, and the faces of the two hosts beamed out at the audience from the digital board, their blown-up faces heavily airbrushed and the white teeth gleaming unnaturally. Each host was labeled, and Wyatt learned that the larger host was called Gunner, and the more petite host, who also happened to be wearing an enormous amount of makeup, was named Manning. He thought the name suited them well. Despite the fact that Gunner was dressed in a gold, spiked crocodile leather vest, Frey grasped onto Wyatt again, this time wrapping her fingers around his forearm, and dragged him back into the thick of the crowd, signaling for Jasper to join them. She led Wyatt over to the bar, and Jasper caught up to them within moments. The large bar spanned the width of the room, and was made of glass lit with a bright red neon light. Around it, patrons bustled about like ants, anxiously trying to ram as much alcohol down their throats in the shortest amount of time possible. The same as any sporting event, Wyatt thought with distaste. The whole scene reminded him of when Wyatt was a kid. John would drag Wyatt to the nearest sports bar to drink himself stupid and watch the footy. Wyatt would be ignored, or periodically slapped on the back as John's team scored a try, or one of his drunken friends told a pathetic, slurry joke. He shook away the memory quickly and concentrated on what was before him. This wasn't a sports bar, exactly, and Frey and Jasper were nothing like his father. Frey, who had been watching Wyatt from beneath lowered eyelashes, turned her gaze towards the bar. Before she could so much as open her mouth to order, a pretty brunette waitress dressed in a uniform consisting of a short black skirt and top placed a tray of sweet-smelling, vibrant blue shots on the glass before them, her excited smile indicating for the trio to have their fill. Jasper took a handful of shots from the waitress's tray, gifting the woman with a sultry wink before he disappeared back into the crowd. Frey caught Jasper's eye. "I have to admit, I do enjoy the perks," she said slyly, lifting the small glass to her lips. Jasper and Wyatt reached out to nab a shot each, and Jasper raised his glass in agreement to Frey. Gotta get that gratification from somewhere, don't we? Jasper downed his shot without waiting for a response. Wyatt lifted the blue liquid to his nose and sniffed at its sweetness, unable to place exactly what it was. The scent unexpectedly burnt down his nostrils. Wyatt had never been much of a drinker, but it smelled like a candy-coated frickin' weapon. As Wyatt's eyes teared up in an immediate response, Jasper caught the watery look and laughed, snatching the drink from Wyatt's hands and downed it for himself. He then slammed the empty glass down onto the surface of the bar and turned away from Wyatt. A strange expression on the man's face. It looked as if Jasper was scanning the crowd for something. Unfortunately for Jasper, or perhaps rather fortunately, he was approached by more admirers of the female persuasion. His focus shifted gears, immediately distracted. Returning his attention to Frey, Wyatt noticed her piercing gaze on Jasper, watching him curiously, consideringly. He moved to take another shot from what was left on the bar, but was knocked into from behind abruptly by a large tattooed bikey-looking man covered in a heavy leather jacket. Instinctively, Wyatt shrank from the intruder, expecting a fight, but Frey only flicked up an eyebrow at the intrusion. "Creator!" The man slurred the word heavily as he addressed Frey. I didn't think I'd get the opportunity to meet you." Wyatt watched as Frey smiled a greeting, kinder by far than she'd ever given to him. And there was that title again, Creator. Since they'd arrived at the circuit, Wyatt had watched as patron after patron had stared at the group, how the crowd had parted for them to walk through, at all the free alcohol, for fuck's sake. Wyatt was beginning to suspect that there was something really important that the team had refrained from telling him. "Hey there," Frey said playfully, clearly not put off by the man's menacing demeanor. "What's your name?" Marcus." The man sounded encouraged by her tone. Frey's smile broadened. She leaned towards him, her body language open to his advance. "Marcus. It's a very masculine name. I'm impressed." Marcus flushed at Frey's flattery and swiped his spiked leather jacket on his shoulders, offering it to her. "I hope you will allow me to present you with this gift, Creator." Wyatt narrowed his eyes at Marcus's blatant drunken adoration and Frey's receptive grin. She took the jacket from Marcus's outstretched hands and inclined her head almost regally. "Thank you, Marcus. I'll wear it with pride." She slung the jacket around her shoulders, a queen with a fur-trimmed cape, and Marcus almost stumbled over himself in his excitement. Wyatt wondered if Frey realized Marcus would likely be waking off to her now, come home time. Marcus bowed himself away from Frey and disappeared into the crowd. As soon as he was gone, Wyatt threw Frey a questioning look. "Seriously? It's a nice jacket," she drawled smoothly before swiping another blue shot from the bar and downing it. A tiny part of Wyatt's stomach uncoiled as he drank Frey in. He realized he was enjoying spending time with the woman she was tonight. Her eyes were a warmer gray, crinkled with her smile, and her olive cheeks were flushed with alcohol and the buzz of the circuit. Perhaps even a little joy. Wyatt thought she looked the most beautiful like this, with her gaze alight and a coy smile gracing her face, her wall temporarily raised to the ground. Another loud roar from the patrons sounded by the placement arena, and Wyatt's attention was instantly drawn in the direction of the far side of the room. When Frey became immersed in conversation with the spiky-haired bartender, Wyatt took the opportunity to slip away, back towards the noise's origin. Unseen by Wyatt, a newly returned Isaiah followed. At the arena's edge, Wyatt lost track of time as he watched pilot after pilot attempt to place and be blown from the leaderboard or rank up to become Wyatt's competition. The first who placed particularly well was Mab, beautiful and nymph-like with flowing blonde hair and an ethereal vibe. The crowd had hushed her while she'd hacked and coded her way to a decent score. They'd given her a standing ovation when she'd placed highly. On her way out of the ring, she curtsied to the crowd, sweeping her arms gracefully, much to their adoration. Mab had become a clear favorite, and Wyatt took note. The second pilot that drew Wyatt's concern was a competitor called Hunter, a man built like a Viking and dressed in themed clothing to match, with a hint of cyberpunk, of course. As was fitting with the vibe of the night, as part of his outfit, Hunter wore an open black fur vest that showed his muscular bare chest, and Wyatt glimpsed a large axe tattoo etched into the man's right pec. Hunter placed just below Mab. He bowed charismatically to the cheering patrons and blew kisses from his thick hands. Wyatt watched as the surrounding women and some men either swooned or fought over catching Hunter's invisible germs like they were kisses from Jason Momoa. A whirl of other pilots followed Mab and Hunter in quick succession. Banshee, with a complexion as dark as ebony and a striking white streak through her hair. Viper, who looked like a green-haired gothic sea serpent. Diablo, bearded, stout, and arms covered in demonic tattooed sleeves. Ninja, a man who looked lithe and deadly. Wyatt lost count, enraptured in the scores and the show each pilot put on for their captivated patrons. The last competitor Wyatt recognized as the one with the eye patch who bared his teeth at Wyatt earlier. Pilot Pirate. The patched man placed last and began throwing a tantrum in the arena at his loss, and Wyatt wondered if going into the competition half blinded by a patch had been such a good idea for the pirate, after all. Pirate was escorted from the arena, still kicking at things on the way out, when his pit captain ran in to disassemble Pirate's spheres. So focused on scoping out his competition, Wyatt hadn't noticed the crowd gather around him. Whispers of, "Creator's pilot," circled from all directions. Wyatt, who had already begun to feel the sickening knot of nervous anticipation, added claustrophobic to the list. And though Wyatt didn't fully exactly understand what the Creator's champion was, he knew it was something important. Something that they expected him to put on a show. Wyatt thought back to Hunter's glinting smile as he bowed to the audience within the placement arena. He snuck a glance down at his own clothing compared to his usual attire. Wyatt looked like a cyberpunk-inspired rock star. Did he fit in amongst the circuit patrons? Possibly. Did he look half as spectacular as those other pilots? The weight in his stomach begged to differ. Wyatt felt a sudden, unexpected wash of resentment towards Frey, Jasper, Isaiah, and Fergus. Part of him felt like maybe they'd set him up to fail somehow. He was Wyatt Hawkins. No one special. He'd never been special. But as he looked around at the sea of bodies, eyes flicking between him and the arena, Wyatt's guts twisted with the equally damning thought. What if they'd set him up for victory, and Wyatt failed them? And then there was Lizzie's file to consider. The voice of Gunnar, who was parading around the inside of the arena beside Manning as if they were the revered ringmasters of a circus, rang through the room, breaking up Wyatt's train of thought. "Some of you sank," Gunnar bellowed. "Some of you swam," joined Manning. Gunnar looked coyly around the arena. With one round left of ever-hopeful wannabes, no one is guaranteed a place in the first round, finished Manning. The two maneuvered back to the arena's center. Gunnar raised a hand, waving his palm like a king. "So drink up, and don't you go too far now. The final placements will begin shortly." Around him, the circuit patrons broke into applause and obscene hoots before segregating into clusters. Those closest to Wyatt began their whisperings again. Wyatt did his best to ignore them.
Frey stood in the thick of the patrons buzzing around the unstaffed bar, watching with a keen eye for Jasper's return. She could literally visualize Jasper manhandling Wyatt back to her from the arena. Though she'd sent Isaiah to babysit Wyatt from afar, Frey wasn't sure it had been such a great idea to let Wyatt watch the other pilots compete for placement. She'd caught glimpses of Wyatt's expression through the gaps in the crowd, his face shifting as he'd observed the other pilots, flaunting their skills as much as their fantasies around their choice of costuming. Jasper and Frey had hoped it would make Wyatt hungry to prove himself, an assumption built from his arrogance in the training room. Instead, she'd spotted hints of doubt and insecurity, the last thing she'd wanted to instill before Wyatt attempted to place, especially when they had so much riding on him. The Viking pilot, Hunter, cut through the line to the front of the bar, sliding up beside her, grinning like a jock who'd managed to bone the head cheerleader. Frey quirked an eyebrow at his confidence. This was only Hunter's second crack at the circuit games, and the Viking had only made it to round 2 last time. Not embarrassing, but certainly nothing to gloat about. "Drink?" Hunter asked the creator, a smug grin painted across his broad, chiseled face. Frey scanned the space around the pilot and relaxed as Jasper guided Wyatt back to the bar by the collar of his shirt. Sensing Frey's gaze, Jasper gave Frey an amused wink and situated himself and Wyatt a few bodies down from them. Frey turned her attention back to Hunter, nodding. "Please." Hunter thumped on the bar, and within seconds a bartender placed a pair of blue shots before them, moving quickly along to the next patron. Frey flicked a glance back over to Jasper and Wyatt, pleased to find that Fergus and Isaiah had joined the men. Jasper had somewhat detached himself, and was happily basking in the attention of some of Mab's clan, consisting of a number of pretty nymph girls in similar sheer outfits. Hunter had cleared his throat, demanding Frey's return. In the time she'd taken to survey her team, Hunter had picked up both shots, holding the alcohol hostage, setting Frey up to come to him. She quirked a smile at his audacity. Wordless, Frey snatched one of the shots from Hunter and downed it without so much as a flinch at the familiar burn in her throat. As he watched, impressed and desirous, she took the second shot from him also and tipped it down her throat. Her eyes on his, she carefully licked the corner of her mouth a little, swiping away the last of the cool blue fire with her tongue. "Another?" Hunter asked hoarsely, his voice emulating his lust-filled whisper. Frey could barely hear it over the music. Silently, Frey shook her head. No, relishing in the fall of Hunter's smile. She'd hoped her rejection would teach him some respect, but knew it probably wouldn't. The Viking was pretty, but an absolute lost cause. Frey began to move towards Wyatt, Jasper, Fergus, and Isaiah, but turned at the last minute to offer the man just one more thing. "Good luck." She paused and watched as Hunter ran a thumb over his bottom lip and blinked at her, contemplating before she plunged through the patrons. Reaching Jasper, Frey yanked him from the clutches of Mab's scantily clad nymphs and pulled him towards a quieter section of the room. Wyatt, Fergus, and Isaiah trailed behind them. The team settled in a far left corner of the main space, just out of sight from the bar, seating themselves in a right-angled formation. Wyatt looked a little uneasy on his stool. "The crowd treats you like royalty," Wyatt eventually said over the bass, first addressing Frey and then diverting his words to probe them all. "Were you and Jasper pilots? What did that bouncer mean when he called you guys creators?" Frey caught the anxiousness in Wyatt's voice. "That's not important, Princess." Jasper, in his sturdy, obnoxious style, cut straight through the tension. "Focus on what's in front of you." Wyatt turned his eyes back on Frey, questioningly, and she felt a tiny prick of guilt run down the back of her neck. She pushed it down, way down. But as Wyatt continued to stare at her, she could see his mind whirring. Still, Frey said nothing, and Wyatt broke away, sweeping his arms wide towards the chaotic arena. "I'm starting to get the impression there's more to this than video games." Wyatt isn't an idiot. That was the problem with curating potential champions. They were undoubtedly among the most intelligent minds in the world. So Frey pivoted, playing instead to Wyatt's social inadequacy, distracting him with his need to know things, his need to belong. "If you make it through tonight, maybe you'll find out." She let the words hang tantalizingly in the air, giving Wyatt time to mull them over. Then she nodded to Jasper, who inclined his head right back at her in sync with her direction. "Fergus, go wire him in," Jasper stated. Fergus slid from his stool, giving no indication that he'd picked up on the rising tension creeping among them all, and approached Wyatt. "Let's get you ready." Wyatt shot Frey a penetrating gaze, and she held it, until he allowed himself to be led back into the sea of excited patrons by Fergus and Isaiah. He knew she'd deflected his questions, knew Frey was still keeping him in the dark from their secrets, knew there was nothing he could do about it except comply. Frey wondered how long they would be able to keep Wyatt in the dark if, when he made it through the first round. Jasper waited to speak again until the trio were completely out of sight. This kid better pull a rabbit out of his arse. "Have a little faith, Jasper," Frey replied.
From the edge of the placement arena just beyond the island of the crowd, Wyatt stood leaning against the back wall, struggling to control his breathing. 3 massive roving spotlights illuminated Wyatt's face, temporarily blinding him as they spun and rotated. Wyatt knew he was cornered, literally. The only way forward was to get out of there and just do it. Do what he could do at home in his sleep, what he'd been doing every day since his kidnapping in that training room, proving himself to Jasper, Fergus, Isaiah, and to Frey. As Wyatt thought her name, Frey's piercing gray eyes appeared in his mind. He knew she believed in him, even if he didn't necessarily believe her. Creators, the circuit patrons had been calling them all night. Everyone in attendance had practically bowed down to Frey and Jasper and offered to kiss their feet, and more. But if Frey and Jasper were the creators behind the circuit games, what were they doing with him? From the center of the arena, Wyatt could hear Gunna's booming voice begin to rev up the crowd, the signal that in barely seconds Wyatt himself would be under the watchful eyes of all, performing just in the way that Mab, Hunter, and all the other pilots had before him. He tried to focus on the giant's words, but he couldn't hear what the host was saying over the top of the thudding in his heart. There was something here, at the heart of the circuit, in the blood pumping through its patrons, in the energetic hum of the electro house music blasting through their eardrums. Wyatt could feel it in the depths of his soul, and if he wanted to figure out what was really going on, who Frey, Jasper, and the rest of them really were, he needed to step into the light. This was his chance, for himself, for Lizzie. His chance to be so much more than line insurance, and force-feeding his absent father acai bowls. He could be more than just mundane and invisible, more than the life he'd resolved to accept for himself. The crowd grew quiet around Wyatt as the roving spotlight seeped into the surface of his skin. Wyatt knew it was time. Jasper stood by the placement arena barrier with Frey and Isaiah, who had returned to them, secure in Fergus's ability to maneuver Wyatt into his round solo. Realistically, Jasper knew that he'd initially taunted Frey over a choice of Wyatt, but as he had settled into his training, even Jasper couldn't help but acknowledge the kid's potential. Wyatt stood a chance, a real chance, and that was just what they needed. And better yet, he knew it was going to piss a certain someone off to no mood. He just needed Princess Wyatt to put his big boy pants on and get the job done. But as Jasper watched Wyatt pace before the arena, some of his earlier doubts slipped back in, through the cracks in his confidence. This kid's one of the best hackers I've ever seen. This should be a piece of piss, Jasper said out loud. He was met with silence as the other two watched Wyatt's nervousness radiate clear as day. He pushed. You wouldn't know it, though. He looks like a stunned mullet in a tank of white pointers. Frey didn't take her eyes off Wyatt. He's not like the others. There it was, that little jab that Frey always managed to sneak in every time the circuit games came around. Jasper knew she blamed him for what happened. She continued, he's not a show pony. He doesn't like the crowd. Jasper shot her a narrowed look that remained unseen by Frey. She was instead looking out across the arena at Fergus, who was gesturing frantically to a panicking Wyatt to approach the pilot station. Wyatt took a step towards Fergus, then faltered, instead backing himself up against the wall of the arena. Fergus watched Wyatt for a second before he turned his eyes on the crowd, scanning through the audience for a face. He caught sight of Frey and braced towards her. Wyatt backed out of the arena, making his escape into the holding pit. Gunnar and Manning quickly stepped into the center of the ring, eager to take advantage of Wyatt's display of cowardice. Shit, Frey said beside Jasper, her voice laced with her own trepidation. Frustration bubbled into Jasper's veins. All their hopes on this one frickin' kid. Jasper gave Frey a light shove in Wyatt's direction. Go! He shouted at her. Frey rushed from the arena boundary, snaking her way through the tight mass of bodies mocking their pilot with jeers just as Fergus arrived. The light in the arena dipped, making way for a spotlight on Gunnar and Manning. Looks like we've got a bit of a delay, Gunnar quirked at Manning through his microphone, unnecessarily drawing attention to Wyatt's retreat, just in case anyone had somehow managed to miss it. Manning smiled like a Cheshire cat back at Gunnar, the caked highlighter atop his cheekbones glinting in the spotlight. Can't be easy being the creator's pet. Probably in need of a nervous wee. A laugh escaped from amongst the patrons, and there, Jasper spotted Viper and Ninja standing nearby looking hopeful. Hunter looked smug. "Let's hope he doesn't wee all the way back home," replied Gunnar, who shared another unmasculine giggle with the audience. This time the crowd took to the joke, their laughter echoing brutally around the arena. Wyatt stood alone, back pressed against the black wall of the holding pit, listening to the echoes of the audience's laughter riding around the arena beyond his temporary haven. Why the hell couldn't he get this shit together? Deep breath in, Wyatt. Deep breath out. Wyatt tried to slow his breathing, inhaling faster than his release of breath, trying to calm his pulse, trying to throw off his dizziness and his mind that threatened to overcome him. He just needed to go out there and do it. He wanted to shake himself, punch himself. Internally, he ordered himself to man the fuck up. But whilst Wyatt's mind was saying one thing, his body was demanding another, and it froze in its determination to keep Wyatt from embarrassing himself under the arena's spotlight and the eyes of the judgmental crowd. He flushed at the thought of what Frey, Jasper, and Isaiah must be thinking of him, of Fergus waiting for him desperately to step back out onto the arena floor. Maybe he could take off, sneak out and run, saving them all the further embarrassment. And surely, when they'd realize what a fucking coward he was, they'd leave him alone to go back to his boring life, back to line insurance. Wyatt was nauseous at the thought. The holding pit door burst open and Frey flung herself into the room, her gait slowing at the side of him. Wyatt could barely bring himself to meet her gaze. "Hey." Frey greeted him softly as she approached, gentler than he'd expected. Wyatt cleared his throat. "Oh, hi, I'm just freaking out," she finished for him. "Yeah," Wyatt exhaled. "That." From beyond the room, the crowd roared its fury at Wyatt's absence. Instinctively, he cringed. Frey continued her approach with a calm smile, picking up a nearby black marker as she came within touching distance. She reached for Wyatt's hand and yanked off the top of the marker with her teeth, blowing the plastic lid onto the floor from her lips. Confusion added to the terrified expression painted across Wyatt's face. Frey cocked an eyebrow up as she spoke. "You know what?" she started. "Don't even think about what's out there. Just focus on me for a second." Wyatt was amazed that Frey's voice was so calm and unrattled by his cowardice, or so it seemed. Wyatt had expected her to shout at him, maybe throw things, maybe pull that knife back out of her boot again. "Tell me why you became a hacker." Frey's steel eyes piercing as he felt the tip of the marker graze across the skin on his hand. Wyatt didn't dare look down at what she was doing. "What? Why?" he questioned. Frey repeated herself. "Why did you become a hacker?" Wyatt had to think for a moment, his mind still caught up on the crowd outside mocking him and the punishment he still thought was coming his way at any moment from Frey. What were the stakes here? If he answered wrong, would she gut him? Could he take her down effectively enough to escape the circuit games? It seemed impossible. But then again, Wyatt had always broken right through those doors. Because I don't like limitation, he said finally, his voice catching in his throat and then smoothing a little as his thoughts became clearer. "So I learned how to go to the places that were impossible." Wyatt shook his head, wondering if the words sounded as weird out loud as they did in his brain. "I don't know," he trailed off. Frey stayed quiet, her eyes boring into his, forcing him to protect himself, forcing him to project himself upon her. He rose just a little more to meet her silent demand. "I'm assuming you have a point? Can you just make it already?" She smiled at him. "Everything you just said." Frey retracted the marker, letting it drop to the floor by their feet. Wyatt followed the marker down, his eyeline dropping to Frey's thick, knee-high steel-capped boots and his own matte black boots. A man's shoe, not the runners or the cheap Big W dress shoes he normally wore to work. Frey clasped their fingers together, raising their linked hands level with Wyatt's chest before stepping into him. So close he could feel her breath, sweet from those earlier blue shots. He finally looked at his hand. There on the surface of his skin, Frey had drawn the exact smiley face that Wyatt had photoshopped onto Greg's head when he'd hacked into Greg's dating profile. The small rush of exhilaration was immediate. This woman, Frey, had tracked him, watched him, and trained him. She believed in him. Wyatt raised his eyes back to Frey's. "Same shit. different arena. Her voice tender, imploring him to believe her. God, Wyatt wanted to. Unexpectedly, Frey closed the minimal space between them and pressed her lips to his, her bottom lip clasping gently around his top. She rolled her mouth and clasped Wyatt again, smooth and firm. Frey tasted of the blue alcohol, and the burn of it danced with sweetness on his inner lip. Wyatt opened up to deepen the kiss, wanting to melt into the strange and beautiful woman, but Frey pursed her lips and pulled away. She looked every bit as surprised as Wyatt, almost as if she hadn't meant to kiss him, as if it had just happened for her too. Stepping away from him, Frey gathered herself, flashing another uncharacteristic smile at Wyatt before she mutely turned on her heel and left. The look that she gave him was the most innocent he'd ever seen her wear. The holding pit door closed behind Frey, and Wyatt exhaled, a hidden inner strength surging from his core and spreading through every inch of his body. The crowd around Jasper was growing restless and rowdy with Wyatt's continued delay. Hell, Jasper was growing restless. From the arena, even Manning and Gunnar were struggling to keep them engaged, both men's faces showing a rare weariness beneath their thick makeup. All about Jasper, voices were sporadically raised in anger, slinging derogatory terms either on behalf of or against Wyatt. Patience was wearing thin, fast, and Jasper knew from experience how quickly circuit fans could turn. Wyatt needed to come out now, or Manning and Gunnar would be forced to announce a forfeit to salvage the tone of the night, essentially fucking him. Frey, stony-faced, appeared at Jasper's side. He tried to read her and failed. Cutting it a little close, don't you think? Frey remained expressionless. He's fine. He's just making an entrance. From inside the arena, Gunning and Manning began their countdown, a tactic to force Wyatt to fight or flee. 5, 4, they boomed in unison. Jasper's heart gave a little stutter as Wyatt actually emerged from the holding pit, walking out to the center of the arena to meet Fergus, who had returned to the pilot station. Wyatt allowed Fergus to guide him into the station's seat as the countdown continued, blaring around them. 3, 2, counted Gunnar and Manning. The crowd mirrored their words loudly. Jasper saw Wyatt nod to Fergus, who stepped back. 1, Gunnar and Manning cried gleefully. Wyatt's timer began, and without hesitation he placed his hands on the gaming spheres that glowed bright blue at his contact. Princess. Didn't even cringe as the device Neuralinked to him. Better hurry, Creator's Champion, Gunnar remarked, leering uncomfortably close towards Wyatt. But Wyatt wasn't looking. He'd lost precious seconds settling into the station and now was single-mindedly focused on his goal. 52 seconds to go. Wyatt broached the first firewall effortlessly and called upon coding window after coding window, barriers shattering as Wyatt charted a course through the virtual maze. Kid's already won his time back, Jasper thought, his apprehension turning to, dare he feel it, enthusiasm. Another barrier down, and Jasper urged Wyatt on. No longer a public embarrassment. Oh, come on, princess. Disbelief surged through Jasper as Wyatt hurtled almost too easily through the final blockade, breaking it down with 17 seconds to go. Jasper hadn't seen timing like this since... No, he wasn't even going to go there. He wouldn't let himself. New record flashed up on the leaderboard with Wyatt's name on it, spinning and bouncing like a poker machine hitting the jackpot. A wall of noise erupted deafeningly from the patrons. Wyatt ripped his hands from the spheres and stood up shyly, his face bright red beneath the spotlight shining down on him and the attention of the crowd. Jasper watched Wyatt's eyes travel swiftly to Frey, seeking her approval. Boy, had she done some kind of number on Wyatt. The leadership returned to a calmer state, instating Wyatt at the top of the pilots list, and Jasper watched the face of every single pilot in sight fall with dismay. He wondered what she was making of Wyatt's score, of Frey and Jasper's new champion. He knew that somewhere, somehow, she would be tracking this. Inside the arena, a flushing Wyatt continued to modestly soak up the crowd's praise. Fergus's grin was giant as he rushed across the arena floor to help Wyatt from the pilot station. And once free, Wyatt looked back up into the sea of screaming forms, eyes landing on Frey, Isaiah, and himself. From beside Jasper, Frey gave Wyatt her nod of approval.
Tempest could see him through the massive gradiating bodies between her and the placement arena. She'd arrived fashionably late to the circuit games, taking her time to have her makeup and hair done just right. strutting around her penthouse apartment in her round one outfit, long enough to ensure she'd made the right choice before she'd shown up, flanked by her faction to the games. Tempest glanced down at her tight leather bodice that lifted her cleavage up to its full advantage, and the short, embossed, stiff leather skirt that flared out from her waist, leaving her slender legs long and displayed. Her entire outfit was aglow with stylishly placed red neon lights, a nod to her favorite color, which was a sure representation of her personality. So much so that her hair was a deep crimson red too. Tempest knew that here at the circuit games, it was integral that she exude many particular traits: passion, fight, fire, and royalty. As the circuit games' only undefeated champion, she had that last one in the bag. Jasper stood only a couple of meters in front of her, leaning against the arena boundary. His shoulders were still and as broad as she'd remembered, his jaw just as chiseled, his hair just as blonde. Tempest hated that. Beside Jasper, Tempest sighted Frey and Isaiah, the trio the same as the last circuit games, only this time they looked happier. Their new little pilot pet had placed well, so well that he'd managed to knock her own record-breaking placement score down a peg below his. Tempest turned to the pretty grungy girl, with multicolored hair at her left and the tall, gold-skinned man at her right, covered in piercings and tattoos. Nyx and Zane were her most loyal companions, her most trusted pit team, her friends who carried her insignia inked deeply into their skin. Her eyes caught theirs. Someone wants to play. Nyx and Zane remained silent. Tempest couldn't contain an amused smirk as her eyes narrowed at Jasper's muscled back, wondering if her voice carried to him from where she stood. Challenge accepted.
They sat close together in the back of a gray, unmarked van in an unlit car park, close by the circuit games that Brent could hear the rumble of music. He didn't know the driver's name, just that the man had been charged to deliver Brent to the right place and to get the job done. He'd asked the man no questions, as he'd been picked up curbside, under the cover of night an hour or so prior. Brent had figured that their mutual employer trusted him, so why shouldn't he? The driver was leant in towards a small monitor, mounted to the van's interior wall that showed real-time surveillance footage of a blonde, pale-skinned pilot standing awkwardly in the center of the placement arena. The pilot was a man grown, certainly, but Brent could see still a childlike innocence in his face, like he hadn't fully yet come into his own, a man still vulnerable to the world's tricks and treats. The pilot had just won. Too bad he was going to lose his life for it. Together, Brent and the driver watched the pilot wave shyly to the audience. The driver tapped the screen roughly with a thick fingertip. "You have your target." The headband Brent wore around his skull glowed without so much as a warning, and he jerked as a feeling of painful electricity gushed like a flash flood through his body. Moments passed before the pain settled, replaced by a feeling of intense energy and euphoria. Brent felt like he could lift a car or fly kick an elephant. Without a backwards glance at the driver, Brent banged open the van's rear side door and rushed out into the night.
You've been listening to episode 3 of Interface, The Creator's Champion. This series is a Red Empire production and a Sound Vision Gold Coast original production, and has been written by Amy Casey, Ellie Popov, and Simon Kennedy.
This series is produced by Amy Casey and Roberto Mellini. Executive produced by myself, Charles Jazz Terrier, Ellie Popov, Steve Chickerell, Wade Boys, and Sherry Hamrock-Rewell. It is co-produced by Alex Contis and Tom Cramsie. Editing, sound design, and music is done by Roberto Mellini and Tom Cramsie. Our production partners are the scandalous, but always effervescent Organic Media Group. And that theme song you keep hearing belongs to my co-host, Ellie Popov.
As you return to your mundane little lives, listeners, my advice to you all is to keep track of our next episode drop. Future information about the series can be found at www.redempireproductions.com. And don't forget to follow and subscribe to us via whatever streaming platform you're listening to us on. Join us again. Live beyond your understanding.
Mark my words, I'll find the light.